Good morning and welcome everyone to this week's Insight and ABSAD webinar. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and the owners of the lands on which we're all meeting. And today we're here in Miagin in Brisbane, the lands of the Turrbal and the Yagara nations, and like to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also extend that respect to any First Nations people who are joining us in this webinar today, and in particular in relation to our topic and our speakers today, to acknowledge the impact of colonisation, including the disproportionate impact of alcohol and other drug on our First Nations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, where we see data come up most recently in 2023 in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people being 6 times more likely to receive or to be engaged in AOD treatment than non-Indigenous Australians. So looking forward to today, because I guess to recognise the resilience of people in that respect. Yes, welcome again today. So we have the privilege and the honour of having a very good friend come back today, a friend of Insight's Nicole Hewlett. And also joining Nicole is Honorary Professor Peter Diabs. Both currently work with the School of Public Health with the University of Queensland, but I know have many, many other hats and roles, both probably concurrently and also in the course of your careers. So thank you very much for being generous to share your time with us today. I'll be handing over to Nicole and Peter in a few moments' time, but just to let you know, as we are in terms of running our webinar today, very welcome to receive your questions or comments to put to both Nicole and Peter at the end of their presentation. So feel free to use the chat to be able to present those. When you do post something in the chat, that will come to the panelists and we'll be able to put as many of those to our speakers towards the end of the session today. Other than that, I don't have anything else to say at this point, other than to hand over to you, Nicole and Peter, and thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thanks, James. And we're lucky you can all hear us, I hope. Yep.
Yes, can hear you fine.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for attending. And just a quick, and we also should add our acknowledgement that we too are meeting in Yanjin and Yagara Turrbal country. So we'd like to add our respects. What we're going to try to cover today is shown on that slide there. We'll talk a little bit about the background to the book and why we've written it. Then we will we're going to go through the main topic areas covered in the book and pull out some key findings from them. And then we'll wrap up with what we think are some important sort of take-home messages from the book. And then finally give you some details on where you can access it. And might just take a note of that little caveat put down at the bottom there, that there is one photograph which does show deceased persons, but it's with the permission of the photograph's owners. All right, so I guess first of all, talk a little bit about us. So Nick, do you want to lead in there?
Yeah, so I'm a proud Palawa woman. I come from Litchfield, which is in southeast part of Tasmania. I work, as James had said, at the School of Public Health at the University of Queensland. But as he also said, we do wear many hats, and my other hat is at the Child Health Research Centre in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and facilitating access to both as the knowledge, resources, supports, assessments, diagnosis, and also supporting, evaluating things like healing programs for community, as James also mentioned, those rates that we have of attending treatments, you know, those statistics can't really be, you know, framed without being couched in understanding the context of the legacies of colonisation, and how do we understand that these are symptoms of something that is much deeper, in terms of the injustices, the inequities, and the intersectionality that many of our people live with every day. And what drew me to this book, other than the legendary opportunity to work with DABS, was, you know, we were sitting on the NHMRC alcohol working group, and as with all NHMRC things, we were looking at all the evidence and combing through every piece of this evidence to develop the alcohol guidelines for Australia. And it occurred to me that, you know, while we have such a dependence on this evidence, and rightly so, we need to, and everything needs to be an evidence-based practice. But I realised that we're not in that evidence. Like, Aboriginal people don't record things in peer-reviewed literature. We haven't had access to, you know, things like university until quite recently. My parents never went to university. I'm the first in my family to attend university. So I realised that there's all this evidence written perhaps about us, but without us. Who is informing this evidence? And this sort of profound understanding drew me to, well, if everything is based on evidence-based practice and we're not shaping that evidence, then there is a systemic bias already inherent in all of the practices that are based and grounded in evidence. And then it brought me to, well, what is evidence then? What can constitute evidence? How has Aboriginal people, who historically have always recorded evidence orally and passed knowledges in the same way, how in the past 50 years have we gathered the evidence and recorded that? And that's what led us, you know, well, led myself to this book to work with DABS. But you've got a different story with your...
Well, yes, some ways a different story. I'm a sociologist by background, and I have worked for quite a while, a lot of it time in Northern Australia at the Menzies School of Health Research, and often with community groups around alcohol issues. And I suppose one of the things that occurred to me was that in the roughly 50 years since about a century of legal prohibition on Aboriginal people possessing drinking alcohol, that those prohibitions were lifted by the various jurisdictions, by the various states in the sort of 1960s and into the early 1970s. And since that time, there have been a lot of programs and policies and measures to try to reduce alcohol harms, but surprisingly little by way of any kind of cumulative body of evidence. And part of the problem there is that a lot of what constitutes evidence was in the form of grey literature, it was in the form of government reports, which may or may not have seen the light of day in the first place, but are pretty hard to find, particularly from a pre-digital age. So I had a strong sense that there was a real danger of reinventing wheels, and some of those wheels never went round in the first place. So that, yeah, there was a need to look back over the last 50 years and try to glean what lessons could be learnt for people going forward. So that's where we started from. And just the main components of the book itself are summarised in that diagram there. And if you start at the top, we've got an initial chapter which we call Explaining Aboriginal Alcohol Use, which really looks back over the various ways in which drinking by Aboriginal people has been construed, the kind of frameworks that have been used, including, of course, at one time, biological frameworks, the public health approaches, the AA model, and so forth. We're not going to talk about that chapter today because I think for time limitations, but I think it's probably fairly important. It sets the perspective, or the multiple perspectives that have been utilised over the past and into the present. And then the next sections, and we will say a little bit about each of these remaining sections today, but just to show you what they are, we start off looking at both primary prevention and early intervention. We then have a chapter looking at treatment and rehabilitation, and then a chapter on local restrictions on availability, the kind of Thirsty Thursday and Tennant Creek, those kind of programs. We then have a chapter which looks at licensed clubs in communities, another way of addressing or reducing alcohol-related harms, and also liquor permit systems. And then the remaining two sections in the book, there is one section on, particularly on recent work around the prevention and diagnosis of FASD and providing support for families with FASD, and then a section on community policing, which mainly looks at community patrols and night patrols. So they're the sections in the book, and what we'll try to do today is just pull out a few key points around each of those sections. But I should add, there's no way we can sort of delve into any depth in the single seminar. So at the risk of sounding like salespeople, we'd have to say, if you want more depth, go to the book, which is available, and we'll give you a link later on. The book is available. It can be purchased, but it can also be downloaded for free. Anyway, so turning to the first of these, primary prevention. Primary prevention programs, particularly in the area of education and promoting awareness and so forth, have actually, in the context of Aboriginal alcohol programs, have historically been favoured, particularly by governments, despite the fact that in general there's not a great deal of evidence, as many of you are probably already aware, there's not a great deal of evidence of effectiveness. In the case of these programs with Aboriginal communities and groups, there's even less evidence of outcomes, although that's not necessarily evidence they don't work, because few of these programs have been evaluated at all, and even fewer have been evaluated with any kind of rigour. So so little evidence, but looking through certainly the accounts that we were able to locate, there are a number of factors which tend to be associated with positive outcomes, and they're listed on the right-hand side of that slide. The first of them is one that comes through again and again, not just in primary prevention. That is the importance of leadership at a community level, and we'll talk a little bit, unpack that idea a little bit later on. The importance of strategic partnerships, both within communities and with community groups and external bodies. The need for a multi-component approach, not relying on a single program. The importance of good data, and that's both baseline data and data along the way, outcome data, so that for obvious reasons, to demonstrate that you are actually making some progress. Programs that do promote cultural connectedness, that tends to be a common theme of successful programs. And I should add, we're not just talking about Australian literature here, we also look at literature relating to First Nations programs in other countries, and it's a very similar kind of picture, I suppose. The importance of having limited, clear and supported objectives, not trying to bring about world peace. And finally, the value of recurring rather than one-off initiatives. So yes, going on then to early intervention, and particularly screening and brief intervention, which historically has actually been neglected in Aboriginal settings for a long time, through the late 20th, early 21st centuries, when there was a lot of emphasis on promoting it in mainstream services. It tended to be neglected in favour of both primary prevention and residential treatment. But that's changed in recent years. There's been a lot of effort has gone into embedding brief intervention screening into Aboriginal primary healthcare settings with mixed results. I think it's very much a work in progress. And we've listed there, because the evidence of effectiveness in mainstream populations certainly is well known, and probably particularly well known to many of you attending this seminar. But the barriers are certainly real, and some of them are unique to Aboriginal settings and some of them are not unique. So the first of them, the competing demands on health practitioners' time, of course, is not unique to Aboriginal primary healthcare settings. But the second dot point there, the episodic nature of much drinking by Aboriginal people and the group nature of drinking by Aboriginal people is more distinctive of Aboriginal drinking patterns, and it poses challenges for trying to monitor people's consumption and get them to reduce their consumption as individuals. And a couple of the other barriers that recur, a reluctance in many cases by health providers to question people, and I see there's a spelling mistake there for patients. It's supposed to be patients, not patents. And finally, a perceived lack of referral options, which is often a real lack of referral options, not much use screening if you've got nowhere to refer people to. The third main sort of topic area we look at in the book is treatment and rehabilitation, which has played a very important role. It's been a favoured treatment modality really since the early 1970s, and it's historically been dominated by residential programs based on 12-step and AA. More recently, there's been a growth of healing programs designed to address intergenerational trauma. And these programs tend to draw on Indigenous healing traditions as well as kind of Western style psychotherapies, and there are many combinations of those two. And again, we go into considerably more detail in the book. A number of the recurring issues there. The first is the sense or a criticism that the treatment systems in place offer a limited range of treatment options, very little other than abstinence. There is a history of issues around governance, that having boards that understand the distinction between management and being a director. There are chronic issues around resourcing, because obviously you cannot have a permanent, stable, well-trained staff if you don't pay for it, so that's expensive, and that leads into issues of staff training. Although there has been quite a lot of work in recent years in that area. Another recurring factor is the complexity. Many of the clients that come into these programs have a complex range of needs other than their drinking problems. So that means you need a broad-based, multi-component treatment. It also poses challenges for evaluation and sorting out what's contributing to what, which leads on to another issue that we'll perhaps come back to later, and that is the
Be over talking.
We might go back. We can go out of order and switch to FASD and then go back.
So most of what Dabs has been talking about in terms of what is effective in programs, if we are able to find and effectively address FASD, you will typically find that we can address most areas, because this is where, I suppose, all of the harms typically, sit, all of the issues, all of the barriers, and all of also the needs for very strong partnerships, incredible, leadership from our community, and that mobilisation. If we can get it right in the FASD space, we can get it right with all the other areas, and you will see that translate to the other chapters as well. So in terms of FASD, so fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, I spoke about this on Insight not long ago, but for those that don't know, FASD is a condition that arises from alcohol use in pregnancy, and it describes the various ways in which that alcohol impacts on the brain and the body of a developing baby. The prevalence of FASD in the wider community is not known, but we do suspect it is, of course, underreported. The only prevalence study that has been done has been in WA, in the Fitzroy Valley, in an Aboriginal community. And because of that, of course, that then encourages narratives and beliefs that FASD is an Aboriginal problem. And this is not exclusive to Australia. We see that, that belief across the globe. But it's actually probably better disguised in non-Indigenous populations. So non-Indigenous people are more likely to be misdiagnosed with things like ADHD, oppositional defiance disorder, and things like that. But we haven't to date had any national study to understand the true prevalence of FASD in Australia. But in saying that, because we have done a prevalence study, as Aboriginal communities are leading the way in Australia, and that's exemplified in the book with June Oscar, Emily Carter, and a range of other very phenomenal women that just had enough of seeing the level of alcohol harm in their community and stood up and mobilised, as Dabs spoke of before. And you'll often see, because women are the social fabric of our communities, and I dare say of many communities, whether you're black, purple, white, you know, it is typically women that stand up and mobilise and will not tolerate any further harm, particularly to those most, you know, that are experiencing vulnerabilities. And if you have FASD, there's an intersection there. If you're Aboriginal as well, that you're more likely to end up in child protection, you're more likely to end up in justice, and those sort of, or commit suicide, have a substance dependence. And these are all things that, you know, are underpinned by both the legacies of colonisation, including the systemic racism that is coupled with that. So when we look at addressing FASD, what we need to do is look at all of that. So it's not enough just to, you know, have a look at FASD alone as a silo. We need to look at healing the impacts and all of the things percolating underneath the surface that are perpetuating alcohol use in pregnancy. So when our women led the FASD Fitzroy Valley, Hope in the Valley, prevalence study, and also FASD initiative, they made sure that they had not just community-led partnerships, but community-governed partnerships. So they cherry-picked exactly who they wanted to be involved, and they insisted, and they knew that they needed non-Indigenous people, of course. So when we say community-led, it doesn't necessarily mean only community. We also, of course, live in non-Indigenous Australia with a dominant culture. So we also need a lot of Western input and role models and people to come in and share their knowledges around FASD, because these women didn't, of course, know how to diagnose FASD. So they called up people who knew how to, and they brought them in, and they determined, you know, in what role will they have, and what do they need to have an effective relationship with the local people. And they determined all of that. So they had clinicians come in, and they had to live, those clinicians had to live in the community for 2 years. And that was part of the conditions. And that's what I mean by not just community-led, but community-governed. And the result was incredible, and the phenomenal things that have been sustainably output from the initiative from WA has been really incredible, in terms of not only supporting women that to not drink during pregnancy, but also the kids now, they are less likely to access, to end up in places like justice, or to end up in child protection. And those are really incredible outcomes, considering the overrepresentation of our people. But it involved embedding FASD initiatives across a whole range of sectors. So it involved making sure that the police were FASD informed. We had to make sure that the social, the housing, the health sector, like there wasn't any area that was not participating and there wasn't a relationship. It required a coordinated response. Because that's what it takes in order to holistically address the social, cultural, commercial, economic, all these determinants of health in order to support that FASD access to knowledge, assessments, diagnosis and support. And it also, and most importantly, required support and appropriate support from governments. And what I mean by that and what I mean by appropriate is governments can't impose, and they had to share the power. They had to privilege the Aboriginal voices and make sure that they didn't overstep. They allowed the community to determine what role even the government had, even if the government were funding each of these steps. And that was pivotal in the success of addressing FASD. But these are all the areas that need to really be harnessed, and it really pins on those relationships as well, and which only the community can tell you what are the effective relationships, what are the people that are respected in that community, that understand local ways of knowing, being and doing, that the community will listen to. These are the knowledges that no one from outside the community, not me, doesn't matter who you are, it has to come from the lived experience of someone in that community. And that's what June Oscar and Emily Carter and the leaders did over there. And it provided profound learnings in which we detail in the book.
Okay, so we'll go back to here. So we're switching the order here. But one of the measures that has been used in a fairly small number of communities over time is the idea of the sort of, if you can't beat them, join them type approach, saying, all right, well, we'll establish a liquor outlet, usually in the form of a club in the community. And the objectives of these exercises are usually the four that we've listed there. The idea that we'll retain money that was going out of the community for alcohol elsewhere will be kept in the community, that the outlet will foster a culture of moderation and perhaps even family-friendly settings, that it will reduce the flow of people going to towns and drinking in towns, not just drinking, but that sort of exodus, and that it will eliminate grog running, the illicit supply. Now, historically, as we show in the book, most outlets have not succeeded in achieving those objectives, except the first objective, which, if the money is actually going into the liquor outlet, is a mixed blessing anyway. On the contrary, many of the licensed clubs that have been established have become centres of chronic heavy drinking, a style of drinking, not the sort of episodic binge drinking that is associated with towns so much as a chronic pattern of heavy drinking and pretty high levels of harms. And we, as I say, we document that in the book. But just we go on to the next slide. So there are a number of lessons, I think, that come out of those examples that have been documented of community-based clubs. One is that there is always a tension between the objective of promoting moderation, but at the same time ensuring commercial viability. And probably fairly obvious why that should be so, particularly if councils become dependent on revenue generated in the club. Another barrier is the presence of well-established drinking cultures that actually favour fairly heavy drinking with the explicit purpose of getting drunk. And that sort of, the idea that the club will somehow change that has proved a bit elusive. And another important sort of chronic issue, if you like, is the difficulties posed by involved in managing a liquor outlet in a community is hard work. It's difficult. The people in charge face huge challenges sometimes to do with the small isolated nature of the community. But the other factor that comes through looking at the past is a conspicuous failure by governments to actually support those management committees and other entities that are trying to manage those clubs. There's been a sort of out of sight, out of mind, you know, you're on your own now, you've got your own liquor outlet, and leave them to it, sometimes with disastrous consequences. In quite a few cases, communities have actually started clubs and then shut them down, and for those reasons. However, there are also a number of examples, and we talk about these in the book, where clubs have achieved the kind of objectives that we talked about I mentioned a few minutes ago. So what are the conditions for that to happen? One is there has to be genuine community support for the club, and sometimes alcohol is a very divisive issue in communities. There needs to be attentive regulation by the licensing authority, both in terms of support and making sure that, if you like, the local committees are managing. There need to be good physical amenities, responsible serving practices, and clear eligibility and exclusion criteria. Where they're present, then there are examples where clubs have achieved their objectives. Talk very briefly about this because it's not a popular, not a widely used measure, but liquor permit systems which authorise approved individuals to bring in alcohol and consume it under certain conditions in places where that's otherwise not permissible. And it's used these days. There's a bunch of remote communities in the Northern Territory, about 20, I think, that have liquor permit systems. And it's also used in Nunavut in northwest Canada. And they're the only, well, there are one or two other instances where liquor permit systems are in place. They used to be very popular. They were very widely used in Scandinavia in the first half of the 20th century, and they were very widely used in Canada through the 20th century. There are a couple of interesting examples these days also, both in Groote Eylandt and in East Arnhem Land around Nullarbor. In general, there is limited evidence of outcomes of these systems is fairly inconclusive. But there are a number of, I suppose, issues and enabling factors. And the three key ones, there's probably four key ones, should be one that's not listed, but one is that, and again, it's a bit like running a licensed club. Running a permit committee is hard work, and permit committees need support, and if they don't get external support, they tend to fall over. There has to be effective policing of grog running. There has to be genuine community support. And the fourth one is that they tend to work better in the more remote the community, the easier it is to make them work. But I think we'll leave the permit systems there. And then the final area that we look at is the area of community policing, which has an interesting and very distinctive history. Going back to the 1970s, when there were unfunded, largely undocumented community patrols set up in remote communities by elders. They were all run on a voluntary basis. There was no government funding. Governments in some cases were really not even aware of them. And we only have very patchy documentation, but they were around. And the idea was to use the community's own traditions and resources for managing and preventing conflict, rather than relying on mainstream policing, which in some of those cases actually wasn't there anyway. So if you sort of fast forward to around 1990, at the time of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, the first well-documented patrol in Australia was started by Jalalakari Association and Tennant Creek, working with the Northern Territory Police. And there's a rather battered copy of the original agreement of the memorandum, between those two bodies on your slide there. But that again was run on a voluntary basis. The elders were heavily involved in it, and it was a way, as I say, of utilising Aboriginal ways of dealing with conflict rather than the more heavy-handed forms of mainstream policing. The deaths in custody inquiry gave them a big plug. It was very impressed with patrols as an alternative to mainstream policing. And so they received quite a lot of attention. And the number of them rapidly increased around Australia, both in remote settings and in regional and urban settings, And then along came the 2007 Commonwealth intervention into the Northern Territory, which we won't go into all the other things that was associated with, but in the context of patrols, the Commonwealth government decided that community patrols were to become a central part of managing violence and conflict in communities. It radically increased the amount of funding made available, but it came at a price, and that price was very increased government control. And it's very clear that the government sort of said, well, these are your core objectives. And as a consequence, the community involvement in these patrols has dwindled. So I think there's it's a salutary lesson there. And we just go on. So yeah, another issue that comes through very much in the whole area of patrols is the pressure of conflicting expectations, where the patrols themselves see themselves largely as a kind of outreach service, as I say, preventing conflict, helping people, whereas external bodies tend to see them as basically a drugs taxi service, get drunk people off the streets on the cheap. And so that has been a chronic issue, alongside more recently excessive government control. I see we're running fairly short of time, so the enabling factors there we've listed. Perhaps I can just take those as read, and we might push on. So yeah, some of the key take-home messages there.
Did you want to? Well, I guess when Dabs and I had a look at this, there were some key things that we thought were particularly important to emphasise. And one of them was that when we were looking at all of these programs, it wasn't about what the programs were. All of them, in some regard, they can all work, but it is how those programs are implemented that makes the difference, and the relationships, as I mentioned before, as much as the programs themselves. So if they are not grounded in the understandings of local ways of knowing, being and doing, and the relationships and the dynamics of that local community, those are the underpinning success things that enable these programs to be successful. And of course, as part of that, they then inherently have community leadership and governance. They typically are holistic, so they are underpinned by a combination of different things that address various areas that also have partnerships with government without excessive government control. They've got interpersonal as well as inter-organisational relationships, intersectoral relationships and coalitions. And also the evaluation outcomes, the monitoring outcomes, all of those are also set by community. They are not imposed in any way. And that's what happens when you are able to privilege and prioritise the Aboriginal communities' values, voices, and knowledges. Yeah, and a large part, because something that I'm quite passionate about is this need to reframe the narrative, particularly around alcohol use and our people. So it's still, and we are still sitting in a very racist society because we haven't ever addressed those institutional issues that are grounded in colonisation. We are still being defined as a problem. We might use different words now, but we are still the product of policies and programs that are set out with the agenda of dealing with the Aboriginal problem. And this is sold still to the wider community. And it's typically, defined as a problem, but not only as a problem, but then we invest in it as Aboriginal people as a problem. And by doing so, we exacerbate those narratives without actually addressing any of it, rather than seeing the issues that arise, as I mentioned earlier, as a set of needs stemming from intergenerational trauma. Now, the dominant sort of narrative or discourse around our people and using alcohol typically it places Aboriginal people as the issue, that there is some kind of shortcoming in ourselves, some kind of genetic failing within ourselves as to why we use alcohol. And then we are somehow a threat to the social order, the safety, the amenity among non-Aboriginal peoples. And what this does is it serves to build fear of Aboriginal people. And if you fear something, what do? You exclude that thing. And if you exclude it, you criminalise it. And what do you do with criminals? You incarcerate them. So, and this is where narratives are quite dangerous and why we need to reframe these narratives. When we looked back at the past 50 years, all those reports that were community-led, we don't describe ourselves in these deficit ways. It was all strength-based. Like, how do we build on the strengths of local communities? And it was also inclusive. So the benefits of what we did for our people were also for all cultures living in the area. So, there is a lot of benefits in looking towards Aboriginal wisdoms and Aboriginal local ways of knowing, being and doing that is benefits for all Australians in this area. Because by going with a deficit discourse, it does lead to impose priorities, impose programs and outcomes that do satisfy no one. And we enter very dangerous areas of recolonising Aboriginal peoples when we put these narratives at the centre of policy making.
Yeah, so a third take-home message really is we mentioned this before, but it's the importance of genuine partnerships and without, I guess the key issue there is that communities must indeed have a leadership place in identifying issues and prioritising programs, but also need to recognise that they have serious resource limitations and also the constraints of the power of vested interests who have no wish to change patterns of alcohol consumption and so forth. So governments do have a critically important role, but at the same time they must avoid the temptation to try and micromanage. And unfortunately, I suppose one of the messages that comes through looking back over the last 50 years is the tendency by governments to veer between neglect and micromanagement. And we've given some examples there. Some of the AMPs, both in the Northern Alcohol Management Plans, both in the Northern Territory and in Cape York with the Queensland government, were examples of that, and also we just talked about community patrol. So it's not easy, I think, for governments to try and find that middle path between neglect and micromanagement, but it's vitally important that they do so. And then of course, yeah, sure. It's really, this is, I think, a fairly simple point, but as people keep pointing out, alcohol-related programs, by definition almost, address the symptoms rather than the causes that give rise. And yes, this is a limitation, but it's important that we don't use it as an excuse for defeatism. I mean, firstly, harmful consumption can be reduced in particular settings, as our book demonstrates, and as the kind of conditions that Nick has talked about, and preventing and reducing harmful consumption even locally. It empowers the individuals and groups and communities concerned, and it helps to create conditions for addressing some of those causal, at least the immediate causal conditions, such as education and employment and family well-being. Without getting on top of some of the alcohol issues, it's very difficult to make progress in those areas. Did you want to add to that, Nicole?
I think this is pretty much what, underpins that narrative. So, and those narratives, when it's deficit-based, we do pathologise. And if we pathologise, then it has also the other side effect of a blame, that we blame people for the behaviours and assumes that people have choice. And I think this is problematic, because if you believe that people choose to have a substance dependence, that then orients the response to it. And so here again, we see blame and shame narratives that they're not helpful, as well as they're quite racist, and they are something that counters the ability to actually provide both a healing informed service, but an effective one.
Okay, so we'll wrap up quickly now, because I think there's a large number of, maybe a few questions, but just a bit of information. The book is published online by Springer. You can purchase soft or hard copies at really very modest prices, or you can download the entire book as a free PDF file, or you can download it chapter by chapter at that address. The project that the book is a product of was funded by a grant from the Northern Territory Primary Health Network, given through the Menzies School of Health Research. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the artwork that we've used in this presentation, but also in the book, by Delvine Cockatoo Collins, who is an illustrious artist in Jerrabah across the water there from Brisbane. And we'd like to thank Insight for hosting the seminar, and you can see the School of Public Health where we are sitting. Thank you, and please fire away.
Thank you very much, Nicole and Peter. That was a very eloquent, I know, summary of a large piece of work and a big investment in your lives and the many other people that contributed to the development of this as I guess, telling a story, an important, incredible story. The themes I picked up there that were central were around, that self-determination is really key and central to this. Funny how that nugget keeps popping up in so many different ways for us to be reminded of, and those impacts, not just of trauma, but some of the structural kind of components to that as well, and that community-led initiatives are what is important. A few questions kind of coming through, and some that have been sent to us here, and also a lot of comments. I hope you're seeing some of those. Hopefully we'll get to reflect some of them. I guess one of the things that was noted there was very much around how evidence lets us, the sense that evidence being scientific evidence, or scientific knowledge being the only thing that can kind of inform this sort of thing, lets us down in many ways, because of ways that evidence is shared and captured in different ways in different groups. We do often have researchers and young up-and-coming researchers and policymakers who attend these webinars. I guess that question is, what approaches for conducting culturally sensitive and comprehensive evaluations of these types of things, the issues, the interventions, would you suggest or recommend?
Do you want to? That's it. So, I mean, for myself, I think the only way that you can appropriately, particularly when it comes to things like where the impacts of colonisation are the most striking, like in the alcohol sector. You really need to use not only decolonised approaches, but healing informed ones. And what I mean by that is it's the entire methodology has to be based and grounded in Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing. So and we've got plenty, of remarkable people that have now published on Indigenous methodologies. So yarning is a beautiful one. And not going in there with your own agendas like that, even that, all of that there has to be a relinquishing of control. And a relinquishing of power. And I think this is where we often see people think they're doing it, but they're not. And even as an Aboriginal person, I still have more power than many of the communities that I go and visit. I have to be incredibly mindful of the privileges that I bring and what that does in terms of, or what the risk is of that as a silencing effect on the people that I am talking with. And the less that I talk, the better it is always going to be. And also the amount that every time I think that I've been in FASD for quite some time now, and every time I think I know, like I'm getting a bit of a grasp on, this area, I'll visit a community and I will sit and I will yarn with this community and realise I know nothing. Because it is just there, and the learnings for me are quite profound, and not that you seek to ever benefit from these yarns, but because of the ways in which Indigenous methodologies work, there is always a reciprocity. And that touches on the other area too. If you are going into communities and evaluating, there needs to be reciprocity at the basis, and that means you bring way more than you ever take. And that should always be at the forefront.
No, thank you.
I'll just add a couple of points. I mean, one is I think that these questions often come down to who decides what questions get asked and how you ask them. Now, the who decides what questions get asked has traditionally been determined by funding bodies, which, yes, they have their accountability requirements as well. But there's also been interesting work done recently with looking at, well, it's not just the questions of funding bodies, they may not be. Let's look at the questions that people in the community, people in the program want to get asked. So it may not be all that difficult to actually, work out a solution there. And the other point I think is that there's a bit of a tendency to assume that if it's quantitative, it must be Western, and it can only be, in order to reflect Indigenous priorities, it must be qualitative, not quantitative, and that's actually not correct. And I mean, and the Fitzroy Crossing example is probably the best single example. So I think, yes, it's difficult, but it's, if people sit down with genuine mutual respect, these are not insurmountable obstacles.
No, not at all. Not if we're really going to get better answers to what works and why. That's kind of, common sense. And I think that what you've said there answers a question here around one of our attendees was asking around, obviously, the role of elders then in these approaches and community, whether it be research, whether it be community-led initiatives, that would be important.
Very much so. Where there are elders who wish to be involved, it's even more vital that they are listened to.
And usually research is asked for by the elders. So you typically would already have a relationship with the community. If you were doing research in the community, you would never, I mean, that's a very colonizing sort of approach. If you were to go to community and say, I've got this amazing research for you, already, okay, that's not a great start. So it's typically from the elders that requests come from.
No, thank you. And I hope you're seeing a lot of comments here. There's a lot of people who have stayed with us, people who are going to purchase the book from the YUIN Nation in far south coast of New South Wales. So we're going out wide and across the nation, obviously, today. I guess if it's okay, given that we're probably coming up on time and some of the questions that have come through, but Peter, you did mention the Fitzroy Crossing. I think we were talking about it also, example. What would you say, obviously that was a very strong community solidarity-led initiative. What would you say were some of the specific characteristics as a bit of a, I guess, overall summary of the elements that were crucial to success, or that being an example that is in the book as representative of some of these elements that were...
I see I've got -1 minute, okay. Well, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, leadership and leadership in the pretty difficult circumstances initially, I think, because, you know, again, there are always people around who don't want to change things. So there was both personal leadership, and Nick mentioned June Oscar and Emily Carter and others, and also organisational leadership, but also patience, a willingness to sit down and talk to all the groups in that community and take the time to arrive at a workable consensus. Building partnerships. If you look at the documentation of Fitzroy Crossing, I think, I can't remember the phrase, but they have a diagram showing all the organisations that were sort of brought to the table. It was very comprehensive. And then, of course, key partnerships with external bodies that could bring in research expertise, clinical expertise. So they're the ones that immediately come to attention. A willingness to address the disagreements as well. Yeah.
It's fairly basic human stuff, isn't it? In many ways. Look, I guess we've come up to time in terms of the generous sharing that you've given us today to come to support our audiences who have come from obviously far and wide across the land of Australia today. So we really appreciate everyone joining us. And to you, Nicole, to you, Peter, thank you very much for sharing some of the wisdom that you've gained and that you've collected together in this book, and also making it available for everyone to be able to get a hold of and to go and dive deeper into this. And thank you very much for sharing with us today, for those who have listened, which I think is another theme that we've heard today about the need for deep listening in these things, to pay attention and then to act on those with that kind of understanding behind us.